some different features of the situation. In early 2006, another lab decided to replicate the Dennett situation. They got a volunteer who, for privacy considerations, will be referred to as Rip, and it'll be convenient for me to have an illustration. So I'm going to use Rip Hamilton, Detroit Pistons shooting guard Rip Hamilton. The principal investigator informed Rip of one respect in which his procedure would differ from the original Dennett case. It was decided that it might be a good idea to have a record of the sensory information that was streaming from Rip's body to his brain and the motor outputs that were being streamed from his brain to his body. Since all of these inputs and outputs were being relayed through radio transceivers, making a recording of them would be simple. They took two extremely high-capacity hard drives and spliced them into the data streams. The motor outputs from the brain were sent to a hard drive which recorded them, and then the radio transceivers immediately read the data that had just been written to the drive and sent that signal to the body's musculoskeletal system. And the sensory signals from the body were received by the transceivers located on the vat, but the signal was again written to a hard drive before being relayed to the brain. Since the data transfer was 100% reliable and took only a few nanoseconds, it was expected that this addition would make no difference to Rip. Rip was also told that after the procedure, a different scientific team would be taking over. The current team was only involved in the pre-operation stage. We'll see why that's important later. Rip agreed, went into the operating room, and was soon unconscious from the anesthesia. When he awoke, he was very groggy for a while, but otherwise felt all right. After clearing his head, he was led into some lab offices for some tests. He noticed that he could walk around without difficulty, and so the hard drives spliced into the input and output data streams must in fact not have caused any problems. He was keen to look at his brain, and thought he noticed it in a vat on the far side of the lab, but before he could go over to examine it, he was asked to take part in a test of his sensor relays. He was led into the lounge area, where the windows had been shuttered to make the room very dark. He was to lie on a couch in the dark and mostly silent room with his eyes pointed towards the ceiling. He was told that a light bulb on the ceiling would flash a few times with different colors, and all he had to do was rest in the dark, wait for the flashes, relax for a few moments, and then report on what he saw. Rip wasn't sure what this was supposed to be testing, but it seemed easy enough. Rip made himself comfortable on the couch and rested motionless in the dark and silent room. After a few moments, the light bulb flashed. The sequence was not quite what he was expecting. It flashed blue and then red in quick succession, but then there was a noise that sounded like a dog bark, accompanied by a distinct, but thankfully brief, pain in his teeth. And now I will give you a demonstration of what it was that Rip experienced here. So, if you're ready, this is dark, and then we're going to, the pain in his teeth will be represented by the word ouch. So, here's what Rip experienced. Okay. All the sensory stimulation ceased, and he closed his eyes. He tried as hard as he could to ignore the meager remaining sensory input. He felt that if he could minimize the sensory input, it would make it easier to project his hear thought out to the vat in the lab. So he tried the Dennett tactic. And now I'm quoting his thoughts. Sure, he thought to himself, it seems like I'm lying on a couch in the lounge, but really I'm out there in the lab, floating in the fluid. Rip tried to manipulate his phenomenological experience to make it seem like he was in the tank. He tried to imagine floating like in a hot tub. He tried to imagine the vat as the center of his egocentric space, and imagine that he was out in the lab with techs walking all around him and looking at him in the tank, while he was simply unable to see or hear them. After a few moments of these thoughts and attempts, the door was opened and the lights came on. I'm going to refer later to this bout of internal thought and Rip's attempt to manipulate his phenomenology as the soliloquy. This is going to come up later in the talk. Rip left the lounge and went to the lab and was asked about what he saw. He reported that he did in fact see the flashing lights, first the blue and then the red, but a moment later that there was a bark and simultaneous sharp pain in his teeth. There shouldn't have been any pain, the project leader said with a puzzled look. We'll check the program controlling the flow of sensory information. Maybe there's some malfunction. While the text began calling up information on computer screens to check the integrity of the sensor signals, Rip finally got a chance to walk over to the vat. He stared into it, hoping that this might help him project the center of his world over to his brain. Before I tell you what happened when Rip got to the vat, I'd like to take a few moments to discuss what happened in the lounge. The episode in the lounge with the flashing light, the bark, and the tooth pain involved Rip making some judgments. Not only were there judgments about what he saw, heard, and felt, but there were judgments about their temporal relations. And in fact, he assessed temporal relations among two very different kinds of events: physical events and mental events. For example, he could tell that the light bulb flashed blue before it flashed red, a temporal relation between two physical events. He could tell that he heard a bark and felt the tooth pain at the same time, a temporal relation between two mental events. And he could tell that he felt the pain after the light bulb flashed red, a temporal relation between a mental event and a physical event. I want to explore the self-ascription of temporal properties and relations. How are such ascriptions made? Well, if one has a certain kind of Cartesian leaning, one might, I'm going to end up here with two approaches to the self, one of which is the Cartesian. On the Cartesian view, the I, the self, the subject, is a substance which has thoughts or grasps contents. If one has a certain kind of Cartesian leaning, one might reply that the self is a thing of some sort, either mental, or if one is a newfangled Cartesian materialist, physical. And one makes self-ascriptions of temporal predicates by examining or otherwise assessing this thing and reporting on its temporal features. A very different approach is to be found in Kant. Kant's critical philosophy in general, and the deduction in particular, are too rich to adequately capture by means of any simple picture. Nevertheless, one can gain insight into some aspects of the richness by identifying some core strands. One core strand of Kant's thought was a reconception of the self, the empirical self, on Kant's view. Roughly, the I is a formal entity, or an abstract entity, defined by or determined by the contents that are grasped. I'm now going to do something that no one should ever do, and that is to produce a one-paragraph summary of the transcendental deduction in the Critique of Pure Reason. Here it is. This is actually going to be important. This isn't just purely a tangent here. Okay, here's Rick's summary of the transcendental deduction. The empirical self, this is just the self, the subject, is not a thing or a substance. It is, rather, a formal entity defined by or determined by the contents jointly grasped. Crucially, not any old set of contents can be jointly grasped. Only those that conform to the categories in such a way as to yield in joint effect something like the experience of a coherent world are possible sets of jointly graspable contents. An empirical self is just the formal, implicitly specified grasper of these contents. If, hypothetically, any other set of contents could be jointly grasped, the result would not be suitable to implicitly define or determine anything recognizable as a human mind. The structure of the world is thus a priori for us humans, in the sense that no other structure could be graspable by anything recognizable as a human mind. Hence, the single but two-sided function of the pure concepts of the understanding, as simultaneously determining the structure of the understanding and the structure of the world. Okay, that's my brief gloss on the deduction. I want now to provide an example of what this means. This is kind of abstract, my gloss here, but I'm going to give an example in the case of time. I want to provide an example of what this means, as well as discern what I think is a motivating thought behind Kant's refutation of idealism. This is a subsequent part of the critique, at least the 1787 version of the critique. It's an interesting section. Using the previous thought experiment and discussion as a launch point. The strand of the refutation I want to focus on is a strand that can be seen as a particular application of the insight of the deduction, as I've summarized it, applied to the specific case of time